Listen, baby, aiko indaba ukuvula asiko isikoti ngitibisi kamalami musukwesaba ngiyofikela kuwe ngitibisi kamalami musukwesaba ngiyofikela kuwe aiko indaba ngeke ngikipele awukuvula ngeke nguwele asiko isikoti ngeke ngiskwele ukuze ngifikele kuwe usakubula kaloku kubona ngathi wena baby nguzophaslahlane kwawo sakubula ngenza isityebi soma ungidinga baby uzongithola la ayikho indaba ngeke ngigibele awukuvula ngeke kuwele asikho isikoti ngeke ngiskwele.
We won't wait. We won't run. We'll conjure up the courage we need to create solutions for our homeland. Our Africa. With our courage, we will innovate for our time.
We will raise up a new generation of independent actors who, with us, will build a new tomorrow.
We won't wait. We won't run.
We'll do it ourselves. We are #DIYAFRICA.
Welcome to #DIYAFRICA, presented by the Civic Tech Innovation Forum and Jamfest. We won't.
Okay, Jimmy.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, good morning, and a very good welcome to the Civic Tech Innovation Forum, CTIF, and Jamfest. Thank you very much for joining us from all across the globe for this year's conference under the #DIYAFRICA theme. My name is Jimmy Madiseni. I am from the Alliance for Community Action, SCS Zambia, and we'll be facilitating this session titled Developing Africa Anti-Corruption Tools. The session co-hosted by CTIN and JamLab in partnership with Corruption Watch will discuss and explore many, as well as reflect on the development of anti-corruption tools and the challenges experienced by developers as well as activists in developing impactful tools for citizens. All right, so we will also bring to light some strategies to developing a very effective way of anti-corruption tools on the continent. Now that we have that properly set out and welcome you to this session, I want to give you a very few housekeeping rules, and I do hope that you like me for that. So if you can please share and tweet today's conversation on social media, on your Facebooks, your Instagrams, as well as your Twitters, using the #DIYAFRICA. The #DIYAFRICA and the #JamFest. JamFest spelled JAM to the FEST. And we really want you to be part of the discussion. So we hope that it is going to be interactive. Please use the Q&A function for any questions directed to our speakers. And for your comments and queries, please use the chat function. Now, apologies, this session is not being interpreted into French, and we sincerely apologize for that. But just so you are aware, this session is being recorded and will be publicly available to on our various digital platforms in different formats as well. Okay, let's get now into it. Joining me on this conversation today, it's my pleasure to introduce Kavisha Pillay, who is the head of stakeholder relations and campaigns at Corruption Watch. Kavisha Pillay is a social justice activist who is currently employed as the head of stakeholder relations and campaigns at Corruption Watch. Kavisha studied journalism at the University of Johannesburg, and shortly after she completed her final semester in 2012, she joined Corruption Watch as a junior writer. Kavisha was promoted to her current position in March 2018 and currently serves as the youngest member of the executive management team and is responsible for managing diverse work streams, which include the collection of whistleblower reports, management of mass public mobilization campaigns, as well as overseeing the organization's research outputs in the field of anti-corruption. In 2020, Kavisha qualified as a data scientist and is currently exploring how big data and machine learning techniques can be used to advance social justice and promote human rights. Kavisha, good morning.
Hi, Jimmy. Good morning.
It's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jimmy.
All right, next, it's my pleasure to introduce Maurice Nyambe. He is the Executive Director at Transparency International Zambia. Maurice is a social development practitioner with 17 years of working experience in the civil society sector in Zambia. He holds a Master of Science in Applied Development Studies from the University of Reading in the United Kingdom and a Bachelor of Social Work from the University of Zambia. And he has spent the last 17 years providing programmatic and capacity building support to civil society organizations in the areas of strategic planning, monitoring and evaluation, advocacy and policy engagement, social accountability, active citizenship, and community philanthropy, among many others. Maurice also holds a certificate in Fundamentals of Social Accountability Monitoring from the Rhodes University in South Africa, and he is passionate about governance issues and currently works as the Executive Director for the Zambia chapter of Transparency International, the global movement dedicated to the fight against corruption and the promotion of good governance. Good morning, Maurice, and welcome to the chat.
Good morning, Jimmy. Thank you for having me, and good morning to everybody that has joined our session today.
Pleasure to have you, Maurice. All right, and joining us, Cherise Takua. I hope I pronounced that. Apologies if I didn't, Cherise. She is the advocacy coordinator from Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism. She is an admitted attorney, having obtained her LLB and LLM constitutional litigation degrees from the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a Bachelor of Civil Law degree from the University of Oxford. She has served as a research clerk to Judge Wallace of the Supreme Court of Appeal and Justices Sikweyiya and Cameron at the Constitutional Court. She also practiced commercial law before joining civil society, where her focus has been anti-corruption laws and policies, including whistleblower protection and lobbying for ultimate beneficial ownership disclosure. At Amabungane, she advocates for media freedom and access to information. Good morning, Cherise, and welcome.
Good morning, Jimmy, and thank you so much.
All right, finally, and certainly by no means the least, let us welcome Samuel Kimeu, who is the Executive Director at Africa's Voices Foundation, AVF, an organization whose mission is to place the voices of the citizens of Africa at the center of the continent's transformation. He has previously served as Executive Director for Transparency International Kenya between 2010 and 2020, and the Kenyan section of the International Commission of Jurists between 2005 and 2006. He was the governance specialist at the Embassy of Finland in Nairobi between 2007 and 2010, and taught law at the Kenyatta University School of Law in Nairobi, Kenya, between 2009 and 2010. He is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and holds a Master of Laws degree in International Human Rights from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, USA. He received his Bachelor of Law degree from the University of Nairobi, and he is a member of both the Law Society of Kenya and East African League Law Society. Mr. Kimeu served a 3-year term as an elected member of the International Board of Transparency International between October 2017 and 2020, and a term of 2 years as an elected member of the AU Advisory Board on Corruption from 2019 up to 2021. So we've got Maurice and Samuel from the TI family, I would say, and we also have Kavisha and Cherise. All right, so let's dig into it then, and I do hope that you remember our housekeeping rules. I must quickly also again thank you for joining us on this conversation today. Now, what we are discussing, in case you're just joining us now, This session is looking at developing anti-corruption tools and how those work. So here is just a quick brief of what this session is about. The effects of corruption can be seen in many spheres in life in the African continent. And when corruption goes unchecked, it may lead to poor quality of life and even death for those affected. Corruption does erode levels of trust between citizens and the government and slows down growth. And many on the continent have had to deal with the consequences of corrupt public servants who are meant to prioritize the people. So let's begin, first of all, our conversation by looking at some of the key areas that we are going to discuss. First is to reflect on the existing tools that we have. We are going to, if time allows, evaluate policy limitations on access to information and how that affects the development of effective corruption tools. We are also going to reflect on problems in the space, such as lack of technical support, funding walls, support from stakeholders, etc. So let me begin, first of all, with you, Kavisha. When we look at the general term of corruption across our continent, it differs from context to context, from country to country. Could I just ask you, first of all, to speak to us on the fights against corruption on the African continent as a whole, from where you stand and how that interacts with innovation and several other challenges that we have. But please share with us from where you're standing in South Africa. I know we will discuss further the differences in context, but how would you describe the general perception of corruption in our continent?
Thanks, Jimmy. And again, good morning, everybody. Jimmy, just to clarify, Corruption Watch is also part of the TI family. So we have 3 different TI chapters represented here today. You know, from where we're standing, we know that there is a huge problem of corruption is a huge problem in Africa, and it has been for a number of years. If you look at the various Transparency International corruption perception indexes, if you look at the Afrobarometer surveys and reports that are released, you can see that our continent is not doing very well in the fight against corruption. And that's why I think tech and innovation play such an important role, because usually in when combating corruption, it's always from a reactive position. Once the corruption has already been done, then we hope that law enforcement will come in and the wheels of justice will turn. And why we think tech and innovation would be important is because it can start to introduce preventative measures and close systemic loopholes. So even before the corruption can take place, you're hoping that transparency through the technologies that we develop will then start to lead to some form of accountability and prevent future corruption from taking place on the continent. So I think we still have a long way to go, Jimmy. There's a lot of issues, like you were mentioning, contexts are different. A lot of the tech tools that we develop is based on information and accurate information. We know that many governments don't put information into the public domain, or if they do, they're of substandard. So there's a long way for us to go, but I think the future is bright. There's a lot of work that is currently being done, and the innovations that are coming out of the continent is really interesting. I mean, just some of the examples and exhibitions that have been featured this week at the Jam Fest, really gives you hope that the future is going to look slightly different, and perhaps we are going to get on top of combating corruption and starting to see some positive impact on the continent. Jimmy, you're on mute.
Let me quickly come to you, Cherise. Thank you very much, Kavisha, again. So Kavisha speaks to the fact that a lot of tech innovation in fighting corruption depends a lot on access to information. That is what I get from her. But then in different contexts on the continent, access to information is not exactly one size fits all. And therefore, without information, one would say that the tech is then, in some cases, rendered redundant. Would you share with our audience just how easy is it to navigate the access to information landscape particularly in South Africa, given your vast work, including the Constitutional Court of South Africa? How easy is it for civic actors whose stake depends on access to information to actually get that information that they need?
Thanks, Jimmy. I think it's a multifaceted question, but in South Africa, we've got the Promotion of Access to Information Act, and that's the kind of legal mechanism by which we submit requests for access to information. So that's kind of a formalized process where we often interact with government organizations, but as well as private organizations as well. And there's distinctions between the two. I think from there, there's issues that are presented, like for instance, where we submit a request to a government organization, for instance, and we're surveying, just say it's a large area and we want to cover all the records from a large municipality, for instance. When the records are sent to us, they could be, sent, sometimes they're just scanned PDFs that need to be OCR'd, and the OCR process isn't always perfect. So it creates kind of patchy data. And it's very difficult to kind of take that information and put it into a usable format, like for instance, an Excel spreadsheet. You wouldn't think that Excel would be something that is, so important to investigative journalism, but our journalists did say that's one of the tools that they use to kind of collect and analyze data. So one issue, a tech issue, and I think that's something that it pertains from the government side, is that information is not collected and stored in a format that makes using it once we are able to get that access, meaningful and helpful to anti-corruption initiatives. It's almost like a stumbling block. So that is quite a concern from the investigative journalism side.
Okay, so how rigorous, or should I say, what sort of red tape do you have to negotiate in the South African context? I appreciate that you've indicated to us that you do have access to information laws, but just how easy is it for activists to navigate the red tape to the point where you actually obtain that information? How soon are you able to get that information?
On paper, it seems like it should be a relatively simple process. There's an application that you send in. You provide a kind of, if it's a government organization, you don't have to provide a reason for requesting the information. If it's a private organization, you need to show that rights were implicated. So you have to make those justifications where appropriate. But once you make the submission, we've actually come across so many kind of practical difficulties that make it quite a laborious and quite painful process almost to extract this information from the department. So things like, it's not possible to find out who the information officer is. That information should be included in what we call a PIA manual. Those manuals are often not updated, so you can't even get the contact details of the person to whom you want to send the information, to request the information. Then the issues are time delays. So there's a 30-day period within which they're supposed to provide the information. But in practice, we see it requires, begging and cajoling on our part to actually go in and remind them, the deadline is coming up. Where's the information? It's not here yet. And we often find that deadline gets overshot and excuses are made. It's become much, much worse during the COVID pandemic because there's been lockdowns. And so that's often put as an excuse as to why information can't be provided. Sometimes you don't even get a response at all. And then your recourse there is to appeal. And if the appeal doesn't go anywhere, which sometimes it doesn't, many times it doesn't, then your recourse is to go to, previously the position was to go to the courts, which is obviously quite expensive. But as of 1st July, the information regulator is now another option, another forum that you can approach. But you can just imagine what I've described. It is a very, very long process. And if somebody wants to actually stymie that process, there's so many opportunities for them to put in roadblocks. And we have seen that, and we do frequently see that. So I would say that we've got the legislation in place, but practically it's not as effective as it could be.
All right, thank you very much, Cherise, and we'll get back to you shortly. Let me quickly come over to Maurice. Having listened to Kavisha as well as Cherise, Maurice, our audience would be interested, I believe, to know what kind of space you are navigating in the Zambian context in terms of access to information. I note here both Maurice and Kavisha speaking about the formalized process in South Africa, the large records that they have to work with, sometimes in PDF, which is difficult to work, in terms of data aggregation and data cleanup, and have to convert that and all of that, as well as navigating the red tape that I've spoken about. How about in Zambia? What are we dealing with?
Thank you so much, Jimmy. First of all, I think this is a brilliant conversation to have. I think that the problem of corruption in Africa is really one, for which the continent has paid a very heavy price, and in many respects continues to do so. So I think reflections such as these, where we look at some of the different approaches that we are using to deal with this issue, I think are important to have. The way I see it is that, the advancement of technology, maybe over the last, I would say 3 to 4 decades or so, I think provides a lot of opportunities, for us as Africa in terms of enhancing our anti-corruption crusade. But at the same time, it provides a lot of challenges in that respect. And I think we have heard from the 2 previous speakers that have touched on some of these challenges, specifically with regard to maybe the issue that you raised about some of the difficulties and challenges that we are experiencing in Zambia. I think that the situation in Zambia is very much reflective of what is happening to a very large extent across the continent. The fact that you have these regimes that usually put into place restrictive legislation or pieces of legislation that are meant to restrict the civic space, or the space through which civic actors such as ourselves are able to engage. And so when that space is restricted, when that space is constrained, it means that even the tools then that you can use to be able to utilize what would be an open space then become restricted as well. And so you become restricted even in terms of the extent to which you are able to either develop your tools or even to make your tools a lot more effective. In Zambia in particular, I think over the last 5 years or so, I think we've endured quite a lot in terms of restrictions that have been placed on civic space. I think the aspect, for example, of the cybersecurity law that was put into effect just a few months ago, I think is something that was very clearly aimed at placing further restrictions on the extent to which civic actors such as ourselves were able to actually do our work in that sense, and were able to actually enhance active citizenship. So I think that yes, we have a very good opportunity now with the changes that have happened, or the big change that happened just within the last month or so. I think that there is an opportunity now for us in Zambia to be able to make real progress in terms of issues to do with civic space, in terms of issues to do with civic engagement. I think that the early signs so far have been good, and I know that we're going to be touching maybe a little bit more on this as we go on further in the discussion. But I think the point I'd like to put across is that the challenges that we have been facing in Zambia are not really unique to Zambia. They are challenges that for the most part, the greater part of Africa has faced. But I think that specifically talking about Zambia, we have a very good opportunity now to make some real progress, even with regard to the anti-corruption crusade. And it's something that we are really looking forward to.
Very much, Maurice. Let me now bring in Samuel. Samuel, I want to take you back to the challenge of collecting data in various forms in order to inform the creation of tech tools to fight corruption. A couple of years ago, I read a very interesting story from South Africa, from Kenya, sorry, written by, must be Guardian newspaper columnist called Michaela Wrong. And I think the book is titled, It's Our Turn to Eat. And in it, the Transparency International chapter, either president or executive director at the time, John Gitongo, I think, narrates a very scary, almost Hollywood blockbuster kind of activities that he had to do in order for him to collect certain information, which then the newspapers were able to publish. I think it was during the Mwai Kibaki era at the time. And then there were all these challenges that eventually ended up in him having to go into exile in the United Kingdom. Between then and now, what differences have happened in Kenya with regards to best practices of promoting transparency and good governance through ease of access to collecting public information that is necessary for civic work in this space? How is it obtaining in Kenya at the moment, this issue of access to information?
Thank you very much, Jimmy, for having me. I think my colleagues really paint a picture that is relatable to Kenya, perhaps only slightly better than Kenya. From the time John Githongo was the Executive Director at Transparency International Kenya to date, I would say that two important developments have happened. One is a constitution. We had a new constitution in 2010 that was very progressive and did make provisions for access to information and laid the foundations of a modern democracy. However, from 2010 to date, we can say that some of those provisions have been undermined, observed in breach rather than in adherence. And it reminds us that the struggle pretty much has to continue. Defending a constitution and to make it applicable to citizens or beneficial to citizens is an ongoing, and it has to be an endless effort. In terms of the access to information, after 16 years of advocacy, we got an access to information law in 2016. The normative framework is quite sound. In terms of observance, we are not quite there. In terms of implementation, we have an access to information commissioner under the Commission for Administrative Justice. But the resources that are provided to that office to be able to roll out an effective access to information regime are quite little. But I also need to remind you that we come from a long background of Official Secrets Act. And even though we have an access to information law, the environment still remains that inspired by the Official Secrets Act, that information held by government is not to be shared. And that is almost a blanket, it's almost a blanket take you find in many government offices. So not much has really changed, except that the normative framework is progressive and we can build on it to ensure we have more access to information. Then coming to your second question about the best practices for ensuring transparency and accountability, may I just lay some two thoughts here. One is that everything that government and public agencies do, they do in the name and ostensibly for the benefit of the citizens. And therefore, any information that is held by government or any entity that is not government but discharges an official function, that information should be accessible to the public as a general rule. There is some limited scope for information to be withheld, but there is no really any basis for information to be withheld. But unfortunately, we have seen that that is not the way it is today. And I had a conversation a couple of years back while we were advocating for the access to information law with a senior government official, a cabinet minister, who told me, we can give you every kind of information you want, but information for purposes of accountability cannot be shared with you and cannot be shared with the public, because there are agencies that are set up by government to be able to receive and process that information. So in other words, he was telling me that you have no right to access this information. And therefore, if we are going to have an accountable society, we need to turn that upside down so that information is accessible to the public as of right. And accessibility, and I think Cherise mentioned this, as a number of facets. And I think the most difficult one I have seen in this country, in Kenya in particular, is how information is told or data is stored and managed for purposes of sharing. And you'll be surprised that this is probably the biggest impediment you have when you need to access information and it is not packaged in a way that is accessible, and you have to be given those PDFs if you are lucky, that you need to go and scan and see how you get them into a format you can utilize. And I have seen government officials struggle with this as well. When, for example, we were doing the second round of the United Nations Convention against Corruption review for Kenya, I did see a number of government departments struggle with their own information in order to be able to make sense for purposes of reporting. But it's important in terms of innovation, again, to realize that technology has a place as an enabler of good governance and accountability from a number of perspectives. One, in terms of prevention, because technology makes things easier to be done, but also leaves a footprint that can tell you who has done what, when, and why. Perhaps the why question may not be that apparent, but the who has done what, when will be clear. And that's an important part of accountability. But it's important to underscore that the ability of technology to fight corruption is in itself a reflection of what the people who create that ability, that technology, have in mind, and the ethics of the people who use it. So technology can be used either way, as a force for good or negatively. But in our case, for those who are engaged in the fight against corruption, it is actually an ally that can be deployed for purposes of making sure that we prevent corruption. We manage for case management where corruption cases have been reported, to be able to manage and assess how those cases flow, as well as for knowledge management to allow us to learn from the trends that we see in the fight against corruption. Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for that. I'd love to bring you back in, Maurice, on the issue that Samuel has raised of withholding information as well as policy limitations. From the South African point of view, or from the South African situation, are there any red zones in terms of access to information where it is by law or by practice that this sort of information cannot be accessed? I know in other jurisdictions, it will traditionally be defense and contracts of that sort. Do you have any limitations or no-go areas with regards to access to information in South Africa?
Thanks, Jimmy. Yes, we do. So that is even built into the access to information law itself. So what we've got is, for instance, where there's private information or personal information, confidential information, commercial and trade secrets, for instance, that's another instance. So if there's a third party's information that is included in the disclosure, even if it's a government organization, government has to be given an opportunity to approach the third party and notify them that such a request has been made, and they can actually object. And so that process has to play out as well. So there's a number of limitations in respect of public information that can apply. So it's something that we encounter when we make our applications, but then what we'll do is we'll try to, in the appeals process, put forward our strong public interest justifications. So all the reasonings about why this information might reveal corruption. And sometimes that's sufficient. But often this is another stumbling block, and to resolve the questions, if we believe that the reasons that they're not providing the information are not actually valid, then that is something that you'd have to take to court, which is a long and expensive process.
All right, thank you very much, Maurice. And just in case you're just joining us now, my name is Jimmy Maliseni from the Alliance for Community Action in Lusaka, Zambia. And joining me today on this discussion on tools that we can use to to effectively combat corruption is Kavisha Pillay, the head of stakeholder relations and campaigns, Corruption Watch, Maurice Nyambe, the executive director from Transparency International Zambia, Shirish Takua who is the advocacy coordinator from Amabungane Center for Investigative Journalism, and Samuel Kimeu, the executive director of Africa's Voices Foundation. Let me bring you back in, Kavisha. So everybody on the panel so far has alluded to the fact that there are some gray areas, some of them completely surrounded with red tape in terms of how people can access information. To what extent does that affect innovation in the development of tools? When you know beforehand that there will be areas that will either be difficult to go or difficult to or impossible to reach, does that play at the back of developers' mind and affect the design of the tools that you think about or innovate?
Definitely, Jimmy. I think it's perhaps one of the biggest barriers that developers have when they are creating tools for transparency or accountability. So just to give you a bit of a background, at Corruption Watch this year, we launched something called the VESA tool. And VESA is a colloquial word to reveal or to expose. And basically our tool gives the public access to information about all 1,150 police stations across the country. So its vehicles, its budgets, its posts, and so on. But you can also then report corruption on this tool. But the main thing of one of the main reasons for why we wanted to develop this was because we found that the public didn't actually have the necessary information about how their police stations work and function. And that led to a huge imbalance of power. So policing, we have a policing crisis in South Africa. It's viewed as one of the most corrupt institutions in the country. And in developing this tool, we thought, well, if we create more transparency in the policing sector, there could perhaps be accountability. Communities can start advocating for better policing. But the huge thing in the development of this tool, Jimmy, was that we were relying on the South African Police Service to provide us with information about their police stations. And as Samuel was indicating in his response to you, the nature of the data that we're getting is quite insufficient. You know, it's very difficult to work with it, and it differs across provinces. So essentially, we went to the main, South African Police Service head office, and we requested all of this information through PIA requests, as Sharice was alluding to earlier. And they take a very long time to respond to you. They note that, well, it's COVID, people aren't in the office, so there's all of those challenges. But then the data comes to you in different formats, and it's not standardized, which then leads to a number of discrepancies and gaps. And now you can no longer actually compare, sort of stats that are coming out of the Western Cape with stats that are coming out of KwaZulu-Natal, because the nature of the information that they provided to you was so different. So I think many of the people on the call would be familiar with something called the Open Contracting Data Standard. And that was something that was introduced to ensure that information in relation to tenders and procurement are all standardized, so that there's 5 different types of information. And I think what needs to happen if we want to improve information is that government has to introduce a standardizing process across the board. I mean, of course, different departments would be different, the contexts are different, but there has to be a standardizing process where data is collected and stored in the same way, so that when we are requesting that information, it then becomes easier to put it out there, and then we're not drawing assumptions from it. I think what we've learned, especially now during COVID, is that there's so much of data out there, and people then start to interpret data to suit their own biases. And that also becomes another real problematic area. If you're not putting information out in a standardized format, if the information is not clear, then you start seeing that people will draw on the information to suit their particular narrative. And all of that, becomes a huge challenge in terms of the tools that we're developing, because you want to be able to give access, you want to be able to give the public information that is accessible and digestible, but you also don't want to be, fueling disinformation or misinformation campaigns if that data can be manipulated or used for other purposes.
All right, thank you very much, Kavisha, for that. And let me quickly bring in Maurice, on the last part that you raised, information as well as the challenges that are faced with innovators face. Maurice, I'm aware that you had several tools, especially leading up to the Zambian election last month that you launched. And one of the criticisms perhaps directed against your organization was that you were throwing out numbers. That's essentially in the public domain of amounts that you were estimating political parties were spending on their campaigns. Somebody would be wondering, what sort of environment were you operating in terms of access to information to come up with what you were then sharing with the public, and that, like Kavisha said, how careful were you that what you were putting out was not amounting to misinformation, as some alleged?
Thank you so much, Jimmy. So I think the tool that you are referring to was part of our wide involvement within the electoral process. As a matter of fact, that is just one of several tools that we developed, not just looking at the electoral process, but different aspects of our governance as well. I should mention that, the environment and the context within which we were operating was not an easy one. You will know that for sure, because even you have been, a victim of the environment in different respects. But I think that, our approach was that we have an obligation really to contribute to the integrity and credibility of the electoral process, and we really felt very strongly that that is an obligation that we could not jettison just on the basis of whatever threats may be there, or whatever misconceptions may be thrown towards us. So we did develop what we called our electoral elections monitoring tool. So basically, this was an online tool that was able to give us a wide range of information. So the tool was used basically to record and analyze election results, of course, but also it was used to receive, for example, incidence reports, as well as to communicate within the network of monitors that we had monitoring the elections. But then the one thing that we incorporated later on was the whole element of research, and the extent to which the tool was able to generate some specific and useful data, which we could then feed into the different bits of research that we were doing. And the one that you have made reference to in particular had to do with the amount of money that the different political parties were putting into their campaigns. I think we estimated the amount that was spent on advertising in terms of billboards, as well as media advertisements and things of that nature. We were very confident with the sort of data that we were able to generate, because it was a very rigorous process that we were undertaking in terms of being able to get quality data, but also data that was able to be justified and contextualized in that sense. Of course, when our research did come out based on the tools that we used, the ruling party then, of course, was not very pleased. As a matter of fact, we did get some calls, trying to warn us, and to sort of to warn us to stay away and not to campaign for opposition political parties, because that was the accusation, that because of the information that we were giving out to citizens, we were in effect decampaigning the ruling party and therefore campaigning for the opposition, which of course was nonsense. Because for us, our take really was that we needed to provide this information that really was important to allow citizens to be able to make informed choices even as they went into the elections. So the environment was very restrictive, but I think that we relied on our greater and wider mandate that we have to inform the citizenry on some of these key governance issues, and that is something something that we were there for very keen and very happy to do. We also did develop a tool, maybe just to touch on it very quickly, that looks at monitoring donations and resources that are being given towards the COVID-19 response. I know that we may be talking about the COVID issue later on, but we have developed a tool that tracks these donations and that tracks the utilization of the resources that have been given towards the COVID-19 response. And I think that is something that is quite critical, given that the pandemic is still something that we are dealing with. So I think the bottom line is that there are different tools indeed that can be used, even in spaces where there is a restriction in terms of civic space and things of that nature. I think there's always ways in which you can utilize that technology to go around some of these issues. And I think this is something that we have seen. I think Samuel did state the fact that technology can either be used for good or for bad. And I think in our case, we definitely have seen ways through which it can be used for good in respect of enhancing the anti-corruption crusade.
Thank you very much, Maurice. And on that point, I want to bring in Samuel on the issue of security. So yes, obviously people will agree that technology could be used for good and for bad, Samuel, but it could also be a danger or an issue of personal safety for developers as well as researchers that are involved in the development of anti-corruption tools. To what extent is there real or perceived danger to people that develop these tools? Because by nature, technology tends to be long-term. So you will develop a tool that might affect the way people perceive corruption for the next 20, 15 years. Before we speak about the cost of development, let's talk about the context in which developers work. Is there assurance of safety for developers, researchers, and activists like yourself in the Kenyan context around the development of tools such as we are discussing today?
Thank you, Jimmy. I think the first place to start is to acknowledge that fighting corruption is a dangerous undertaking because it's pretty much entails speaking truth to power and taking on the high and mighty. Corruption in our continent largely is not driven by your common citizen, the man in the street. It's driven by the people who make policy, the people who make decisions in government. That is, those are the people who work out and execute corruption, and they can pretty be dangerous if they feel threatened. So to that extent, whenever citizens have or developers have come up with tools that aid citizens to challenge corruption directly, then the risks will always be there. I think developers have to bear in mind that risk. And I think I have seen one of my most favorite development was an app called Empower that is no longer in existence. And it was so powerful that I think it had to be taken down. That said, I think there's quite some good space in the Kenyan space to innovate in this direction. And I think government agencies and civil society organizations have worked together to come up with tools that facilitate citizens to participate in the fight against corruption. And I have in mind, for example, one of the pioneers, something called the Integrated Public Complaints Referral Mechanism. That was an initiative of Transparency International Kenya, working with 6 government commissions, independent commissions that have a complaint receiving mandate. And this was a recognition that these commissions could synergize and provide cross referrals of complaints to one another, so that if I have a corruption complaint, I can go to the Human Rights Commission and report that, or to the Commission on Administrative Justice, and it will be received and transmitted to the relevant entities. And I think also a few other, innovations, again, quoting from TI Kenya, Maurice has mentioned the COVID-19 tracker, which I am aware that Transparency International Kenya has also been implementing, but also something they call the Action for Transparency application. That is an app that has been used to provide information to citizens, but also allow for citizens to report on corruption complaints. But bottom line, Jimmy, is that to the extent that these innovations are geared towards fighting corruption, the risk of the personal security risks are inherent and will remain until we turn a corner in the fight against corruption.
Thank you very much, Samuel. We'll move on now to discuss stay rather on the conversation of security vis-a-vis the costs at which corruption is fought. But this time, though, I want to focus on the cost of fighting corruption in terms of how much it really costs to develop these tools and put them out. And I want us to discuss this topic, this part of the topic, because it's one thing to get the information, refine it, and package it. It's a completely different thing to make that information yourselves as activists easily accessible to the public. Sharice, I want to bring you back in on this particular point. At Amabungane, when people go to your website, you've got whistleblower opportunities and all of that. What costs are associated with these tools? At what cost do you, as an organization in the South African context, have to deal with to ensure that not only are you getting the information, but you're making this information available, and is that sustainable? Are we able to stay in this fight for the long haul?
Thanks, Jimmy. So we have to use technological solutions in order to ensure that we obtain information. So while I did mention the PIA process, we also, investigators at Amabungane use many different types of resources to collect information. And these can include apps like even Google Earth, even just Google is very useful, but there's also a number of other resources that we draw upon, and those include databases, search websites, repositories of company information, and the cost of accessing these does add up. So there is quite a cost-intensive aspect to this type of acquisition of information, and I think to the extent that it's possible to find other means of getting this type of information, it would very much assist with that. On the other side, you did mention we've got our tip-off line, and we have to constantly evaluate our security to make sure that our people who make disclosures to Amabungane, to our investigative journalists, are confident and secure that the information is not going to be spied upon or used against them. So we have to always be evaluating our technology, just even the hardware that we use, as well as our software. And those costs do add up. We've got a technical expert that whose services we employ, because we realize that if we let our guard down, there could be very serious consequences. So investigative journalism is a very cost-intensive exercise, a very time-intensive exercise, but the result is ultimately worth it. But it doesn't come cheap or quick.
Thank you very much, Sharice. And as we begin to wind down the conversation, I want to get again to you, Kavisha. And specifically, I want you to address the issue of corruption and transparency during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I hope everyone gets an opportunity to say something about this. To what extent has the pandemic influenced how developers have been able to work, and how you've been able to see or not to see the increase or lack there of corruption? Essentially, the long and short of my question is, we are in a pandemic, access to information is difficult, tools must still be developed, the public must still get information. How does this mix affect your work as developers of tools, anti-corruption tech tools?
Thanks, Jimmy. I think with the pandemic, a lot of our work had to move online. So dealing with whistleblowers, for example, before we'd have whistleblowers would come visit us at Corruption Watch, you can no longer do that. So you have to make sure that you have the necessary tools that people can access and easy tools that people can access so that they can blow the whistle. Even engagements with communities or with other stakeholders, everything has gone online. So, well, most things have gone online. So we're starting to sort of gradually shift there. So I think in that, the positive is that there is, because we are going in that direction, and there's perhaps more comfort in terms of introducing online tools. And, just to touch on the previous question that you posed to Sharice, it is quite costly, and funders, don't necessarily like to invest, at least from our experience, in tools, in online tools, because there's still a huge digital divide. So trying to get funders to invest in these projects, pre-COVID used to be quite difficult, whereas now there's that understanding of social distancing and everything is going online. It is potentially making it a bit easier. But just in terms of COVID and what's been going on, South Africa, we've seen very high levels of corruption, a lot to do with the sort of procurement of personal protection equipment, PPEs, so your masks, your sanitizers. There's been major scandals there at very high levels of government, but we also saw an increase in reports last year, just in terms of, for example, police continuing to harass people whilst, enforcing the lockdown, ward councillors, politicians, selling off food parcels, and at schools, there's a lot of issues going on in our, at the schools where around the procurement of PPEs and sanitizers. So we started to see corruption manifest in almost all sort of sectors of society. And, one of the things that the government said very early on in the pandemic and during the lockdown was our president came out and said, we're going to deal decisively with corruption, and, we're going to be transparent about this, and you can hold us accountable. And for the first few months, there was a willingness to release information. So, for example, in the province that I live in Gauteng, the Gauteng provincial government was releasing something called expenditure disclosure reports that was highlighting where the money was going and being spent. And journalists were starting to pick up, that there was all of this PPE issues. There was issues around fogging, a lot of a lot of money in the hundreds of millions was going into, doing unscientific things like fogging classrooms, which we know now is not necessary. And because there was accountability, they were being transparent with the information, but now they were starting to be held accountable for their decisions. They started to backtrack on the various measures that they put in place to, bring the public into the confidence, because the public now was starting to ask hard questions. So it is, Jami, I don't know where we are going to go. I mean, initially I felt very positive about what the government was trying to do in terms of, introducing added measures and layers of transparency, but they quickly, did a turnaround and backtracked, which, not unexpected, but I think we as civil society have a lot of work on our hands to make sure that even, post-pandemic, if we ever get to that point, that information should be put out on a regular basis, on a proactive basis, and not through sort of prior requests. And that we need to ensure that, our government doesn't operate under this veil of secrecy as they usually do, because they're trying to sort of hide information that's necessary for the public. So I do think that it's going to be, there's a lot of work still left to do with civil society in terms of ensuring the proactive disclosure of information going forward.
Thank you very much, Kavisha. Unfortunately, time fails us. This was a 1.5 hours conversation. It could have been 2, it could have been 3, I believe, and we still wouldn't have exhausted everything that we had to say. I apologize that our time is up and we've got to go. But before we do, I'm glad to let you know that the conversation has been recorded, so you can let others come back to it and have a listen. Most importantly, though, when you go to the chat, you will find the link to the exhibition I spoke about. There is a very informative chart by my good friend Zukiswa Kota and JD. I hope I remember JD's name correctly. And both of them were speaking to the ins and outs of the Keep the Secrets too, and it is one of those exhibition items that I found really interesting. You could check that out in the chat, and you could also check out veza.org. It's veza.org.za, and there will be a lot of stuff for you to learn from there. There is a hand up from Melissa. Yes, Melissa.
Hi, Jimmy. Just here to remind you that we still have 30 minutes. So the session is supposed to end.
30 minutes.
Yes. So you can
thank you very much. Where did I get 11 hours from?
I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm the happiest man in the world right now. Thank you for that quick reminder. So which means that then we can complete our conversation on the challenges of COVID-19 on the fight against corruption. So Maurice, I was going to get to you, and then I misled myself thinking that our time was up, but it's not up. So in the next 2 to 3 minutes, Maurice, I would love you to discuss the challenges that COVID-19 has brought in terms of access to already difficult to access information in the Zambian context, and how you were able to navigate that space. You had COVID-19, you had elections that were restrictive, but the work still had to go on and the tools still had to be developed.
Yes, indeed, Jimmy. Thanks very much. I think that Kavisha has touched on some challenges that we identify with as well. The fact that COVID has really forced us to, in a sense, it has forced our hand in terms of us being innovative and really thinking creatively around how we can, continue our engagement, even in a very restrictive and difficult context. But I also needed just to mention that, experience has shown us in the past that corruption actually tends to thrive or can thrive in times of a crisis or emergencies. And I think that has been the case even with the COVID pandemic. I mean, just last year, maybe to touch on something that happened in Zambia, we did learn that, close to around equivalent of $100 million worth of, public funds that were donated to the COVID response were actually stolen. And so even in the midst of a pandemic, really, there still tends to, to be quite high levels of corruption. And I think that is something that compelled us and even encouraged us to come up, with a COVID tracking tool that I spoke about earlier. But I think that in terms of what the pandemic has done, it has really opened us up to, to innovation in terms of being able to think a lot more critically about how and what else we can do within the context of what is available to us to be able to enhance our anti-corruption fight. And particularly for us as TI Zambia, I think one of the things that we have tried to do very hard is really to see how we can bring the masses along, or how we can bring the public along in terms of our anti-corruption interventions, because we have learned from the past that citizens have always been interested in taking part in anti-corruption interventions, but it's like we've never really created the spaces and platforms through which they can actually interact in that sense. And so one of the other tools that we developed last year with the support of our friends from Germany, GIZ, was an online tool called the Share Your Story campaign, which is actually a website that we have developed where citizens are able to report their experiences with corruption in terms of how they are able to, basically the corruption that they have observed or the corruption that, has affected them. So this is a tool really that allows citizens to come into the picture in terms of the fight against corruption. And one of the sub tools that we have developed in relation to, to complement this website is an Android-based game called Race Against Corruption, where again we're trying to target maybe those of a younger orientation, people that like youths and even younger people, to be able to be involved also in this fight, because we believe that this is a fight that needs the concerted effort of everybody if we are to make any real progress. So those are some of the ways in which we have tried to navigate the challenges that COVID has thrown. But for us, we don't really like to see them as challenges. We'd like to see them as opportunities opportunities that have been created for us to become a lot more innovative, even in terms of our work.
All right, thank you very much, Maurice. So Cherise, Maurice sees those as opportunities rather than challenges. For you, though, I have a question coming from Luyanda from our Q&A tab. And Luyanda is asking, what are the implications of the Protection of Information Act on citizens' right to information? So on the one side, you shared with us earlier that you do have access to information legislation in South Africa, but now you also have Protection of Information Act. How does that water down, or how does that affect citizens' rights to information? Luyanda is asking.
Thanks, Jimmy. Yes, I was also very interested to see that question, because this is something that we are grappling with as we speak. So the Protection of Personal Information Act, or what we call POPIA, came into effect on the 1st of July. And what we've seen subsequent to that is a real reliance on this legislation to refuse access to forms of information that were previously uncontroversial. So one such example is access to details of share registers. So basically, who are the shareholders of a company? And this information is absolutely essential if you want to find out who the ultimate beneficial ownership of a company is. That means piercing the various levels of shell companies in order to get to the person who actually derives the benefit. So this is really essential information, and it's provided for, access to that information is provided for in our Companies Act. Yet what we've seen now is that when we've made requests for access to these types of information, we get a response saying it contains the personal information of the shareholders, and therefore we cannot provide it to you. This is a position that's been taken by Straight, who is the repository of the uncertificated shares in South Africa. So this is very concerning to us, and we feel like this is probably just the tip of the iceberg. We are probably expecting that this is going to be put up as a reason to deny access to information going forward. So we actually would want to engage with the information regulator on this to get clarity and potentially just issue a guidance note, because the intention of POPIA, or the Protection of Personal Information Act, is not meant to intrude on access to information in terms of PIA, or the Access to Information Act. So there's definitely a tension between these two pieces of legislation. For our view is that public information remains public information, whether it contains that types of personal information in it. There's definitely a balancing that can be struck. But in relation to, for instance, company information, when somebody is a shareholder in a company, or if they're a director in a company is not a purely private entity. It has implications for society in general. And especially when you've got limited liability in a company, by enjoying that protection, you have to give up some of your rights as a shareholder, and that could mean a measure of your privacy, where it extends to things like your name and the fact that you own shares, and maybe potentially an identifying a feature like an ID number. And that was actually held by our Supreme Court of Appeal. So definitely this is a very interesting question, and we're hoping that it's not going to be a long fight, that the information regulator will clarify the position relatively swiftly, so that it can't be relied on when we make requests that may contain personal information.
All right, thank you very much, Cherise. There is a second question now in our Q&A, and this is from Zuki. And this is directed to me. She says, Jimmy, may I lean on your experience in the context of Zambia and your work at SCA? The example of fire trucks comes to mind. What would you categorize as major lessons about what kind of reform should be prioritized in Zambia? Thank you very much for that question, Zuki. And just for the sake of those that may not be aware of the fire trucks contract that Zuki is referring to, in 2017, the Zambian government procured 42 fire tenders of the Scania brand from a company called Rosenbauer. And the declared amount of a unit of those trucks was $1 million. And so they were famously referred to as 42 for 42. So the publicly mentioned cost for that tender was $42 million, translating to $1 million per unit. However, there was public outrage because people thought that what the government had declared was way too extravagant. It just didn't make common sense when you looked at the units that were being referred to as having cost $1 million each. Was simply not believable. And so now to answer Zuki's question, what we learned was that Zambia needs as a starting point the very basic best practice of access to information regulation. I'll let Maurice come in on this as well when I'm done, because what we were dealing with and what we are still dealing with at the time is, at the moment, is a situation where the country has absolutely no access to information regulation whatsoever. And so we had to rely on a lot of what I would say unofficial channels for us to access that information. And then on the other side, we had to rely on open source investigation on our own as an institution. So that was a contract perhaps that in a situation where you have access to information could have been a week or whatever statutory time is set, 13 days, for instance, I've learned from Maurice. We could have had that information within that 13-day window. But what happened in our situation was that, first of all, we were stopped for what the regulator of public tenders in Zambia, the Zambia Public Procurement Authority, said was proprietary information. So we were stopped from knowing the ownership of the people that bid for the tender, who was involved in all of that. We only got the specifications for the trucks from a whistleblower within the ministry, because we needed to know what the specifications of the trucks were for us to have a reasonable estimation of how much they would cost. And then secondly, we had to do open source investigations on our own as a fact-checking unit at the ACA. So for example, we wrote to Scania, who were the manufacturers of the chassis, who then sent us to Rosenbauer, the manufacturer of the superstructure, who refused to give us the information. Thankfully, though, through open source investigations, we're able to find the shipping company that moved the trucks from Europe to Walvis Bay in Namibia, and using a tracking application for ships, we were able to backtrack the routes of the fire tender, the ship that carried the fire tenders, and we traced that the voyage began in Austria. But it was impossible to know whether or not the trucks were actually loaded onto the ship in Austria. But all we could do was to find the route, and using the specifications, we were then able to go to the website of the manufacturer and then compare similar units to find out how much they cost. The manufacturer also has a plant in South Africa, and I'm glad to see Jay in the audience. And so through our partnership with PSAM, Jay was able to use the South African access to information legislation to put in an application for us to get a bit of information from Rosenbauer, South Africa. In all, that process took us over 6 months, everything I'm explaining now. And so ultimately, Zuki, the long and short of my answer is that what Zambia needs at the moment is just to have a form of access to information legislation that would enable citizens to have a reasonable amount of a reasonable space into public information. I was chatting with the panelists before we came on, online here, that watching you and JD essentially mourning about having not enough information for you to do the Keep the Receipts project is absolutely mind-blowing for me and Maurice in the Zambian context, because that looks like a gold mine. Over 500,000 public documents on that too is absolutely amazing for the Zambian context, where we have 0 documents, that we can't even think about a tool like Keep the Receipts at the moment, simply because we have this legislative bottleneck that needs to be broken entirely. I'll let Maurice come in on that challenge as well.
Yes, indeed, Jim. I think you've really hit the nail on the head. I think there is no doubt that us enacting access to information legislation really will be a game changer in terms of our advocacy efforts and work in Zambia. But also just to touch on the specific example that Zuki has asked about and that Jimmy was just explaining. I think that Jimmy and his friends at SCA really did a fantastic job on the fire tenders issue. I think one of the key things that was very clear was that they ran a very effective social media campaign, and one of the things that campaign did, from my point of view, is that it sort of galvanized young people into developing this interest in issues to do with governance in Zambia. And so it was examples such as that piece of work that the Alliance for Community Action did, for which some of them were arrested, by the way. It was examples such as those that really galvanized the youth movement in Zambia into this very massive movement that suddenly became aware of the need to actually take part in the governance of their country. And when you look at the fact that the results of the election that we had just over a month ago, the youth vote actually happened to be the one that really was at the center of the change that we were able to obtain. So I think the point I'm making is that yes, it was a very difficult context, even in respect to the specific campaign that Jimmy has touched on. But I think that the results of that campaign were a lot more long-term and a lot more useful than maybe the persecution that the team at SCA suffered. And I think that is just a fantastic example of how some of these challenges can be navigated.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Now I know for sure that we've got just a quarter of an hour to go. And I'd love to begin this final leg with you, Samuel. Having discussed at length the tools, the challenges that come with that in terms of fighting corruption, I want to begin the final leg with you, Samuel, by asking the question that everybody else, everyone on the panel, I would love you to address. The question of the interaction between citizens and the anti-corruption tools that we develop as civil society and as independent civic actors. What has been the public, what has been the effect on the public? To what extent have the public responded to anti-corruption tools? And do you think in your view, the public response has been effective or has been what the developers have desired from the go?
Well, thank you, Jimmy. I think that question, the answer to that question is pretty much relative. And looking at the array of tools that I've interacted with over the years, I see that the uptake usually is not uniform. Sometimes you have an interest from citizens to use a tool, and sometimes the numbers that are using that tool are fairly subdued. But one thing is for sure, when COVID hit and social distancing was enforced, I think many citizens found refuge and solace in terms of being able to communicate, gather information, complain through these online tools, through their phones, because most of this technologies is available on phones, and many Africans do own telephone sets that they can use, mobile telephone sets that they can use to access the internet and these tools to be able to report and to give their own views. And just to add a little bit more on that, Jimmy, Africa's Voices is an organization that utilizes mass media, SMS technology, and social science research to make sense of conversations happening in society at scale. And during these last 1.5 years, I can tell you that we saw an interest in citizens in participating not just in the radio shows that we were having, where they were seeking information and asking questions about COVID, even accountability questions, but also responding to questions about, for example, the quality of services they were getting in hospitals and whether they were accessing hospitals during that period, and what their experience was, and whether there were, in fact, any corruption challenges that they faced during that period. So I could comfortably say that in 2020 in particular, Africa's Voices engaged with the highest number of citizens ever in Kenya and in Somalia. So this is clearly something that I could say is relative. Again, the topics for conversation or the, let me say, the purpose of the tools also affects interest. Sometimes citizens are interested in certain aspects of accountability, and others, the interest may not be that much. I would imagine, for example, in the case that Maurice has related in Zambia and in the elections, which is a matter of interest for me, that citizens would have been very animated to participate and be a part of the change that Zambians were going through. So I would say that it is the tools are important because they connect people and they allow people to access institutions and to access platforms where they can give their own views, the information. They can complain and seek solidarity that wouldn't otherwise be there, particularly when social distancing is there.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Now on to you, Kavisha. As developers and citizens, what is your view on the uptake, and to what effect are these tools really having an effect on the public and in the way that they are able to hold their elected leaders especially accountable?
I mean, from our perspective at Corruption Watch, we have different reporting channels where whistleblowers can disclose information. And over the last 9 years, we've received over 35,000 whistleblower complaints. So there's definitely an appetite to use these tools. And since we launched Veza in the beginning of this year, I think in the first 6 months, we had, over 100 police corruption complaints and 10,000 users. So, for a pilot phase, it wasn't too bad. I do think that there is an appetite to be able to use these tools for accountability, but I also think that as civic actors, we have a responsibility to not just produce tools and put it out there, but to make them accessible and encourage communities to use them and show people and train people how to use them. So simple things of language, sometimes can be really difficult. So making sure that, information that you put out there is not just in English, but in language and translated into various languages. You're then ensuring that more people can act on that information. But, COVID has made it slightly difficult, for Corruption Watch, for example, to go out into communities where we would usually do trainings on, how corruption manifests in different sectors. And when we initially conceptualized the Veza tool, we thought that we'd go out and take the tool to different communities and, basically do demonstrations, encourage people to have conversations about this. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that because of the lockdown, but it is something that we are very passionate about. So yes, the development and the sustainability of the technology is really important, but if people aren't using it, then it doesn't mean anything. And, visits to a site, can sort of be an indicator of success, but how we're looking at it is how has a community or an individual taken the information that we provided to them and then try to effect some form of change. And that is the impact that we are going for, not necessarily how many, web hits or, that you received. So there's, in terms of impact, I think that there's a lot that innovators need to do, not just in thinking about the type of products, but in terms of the usability, accessibility. How do we get this into the hands of ordinary people? And I think on that front, there's lots of amazing ideas out there, but there needs to be a lot more thought and consideration put into getting our tools out to people so that they could effectively use it in order to bring about change.
Thank you very much, Kavisha. Cherise, please share with us and our audience from the Amabungane perspective. how interactive are your tools with the general public, and to what extent is their impact in terms of how the public responds to the issues that are raised?
I think the Amabungane perspective is somewhat unique here because we are not kind of a publicly engaging organization. We're a group of investigative journalists. So kind of the work that we do is more about collecting information, and definitely I don't want to discount the tip-offs that we get from members of the public are absolutely essential to what we do. But we also take that and build on that. And I think a message that I wanted to relay is that for potential developers of tools or people who are interested in fighting corruption, in the hands of investigative journalists, any type of information can be gold. So when I surveyed our journalists about what kind of tools and technology solutions they use, even things like repositories of information like mining rights, so the mining cadastre, things like satellite imagery, the technology that tracks the movements of ships and planes, they help to build the narrative that investigative journalists use that, draws the links between this potentially corrupt actor and another to kind of unearth these networks of patronage. So if someone is interested in developing these types of tools, I would say, be creative and think widely. It may not be something that's necessarily focused on exposing a corrupt actor and the person engaging in the transaction. Something else might actually provide the information that completes the puzzle. So from the investigative journalism perspective, there's definitely a wide variety of information that can help our journalists to do their investigations, and in so doing expose corruption so that those who are responsible to hold those to account can actually act on that.
Thank you very much, Maurice. And lastly, Maurice. So, and I must say very quickly that a couple of tools as examples, but also as ongoing innovations have been shared in the chat. And so if you could go there and click on the several links that colleagues have shared, you'll definitely be able to get to understand some of the innovations that have been discussed in this session. But also it is important for me to mention that there is a link to a survey that has been shared. And so please do go over there and click on the CIVITEC Innovation Network survey. It's just about 5 minutes, according to what's been written there, in order for us to help them understand what the community can do better. So please do take the survey there on MailChimp, and it is there in the chat. On to you, Maurice. Please share with us from the Transparency International. I know you have a game like you just mentioned, and it's there in the chat, but also I'm most interested for you to speak to the tool that allows people to share their experience with corruption, either they themselves or something that they have observed. What have we learned from that?
Yes, indeed, Jimmy. I think maybe just to touch on some previous reflection earlier on, I think that the aspect of usability for whatever tool that you develop in the context of the anti-corruption fight really is something that needs to be given a lot of focus. But also, I think one of the lessons that we have learned is that it is important that when you are developing tools, for example, that are meant to fight corruption in our context, it is important that you do not develop these tools in isolation, so to speak. So I think that in order for you to get the most out of whatever tool you are developing, you need to tie it to a particular maybe advocacy campaign, for example, that you are doing. So for example, with our tool on the Share Your Story campaign, we have tied it to us, the campaign that we have to sort of raise awareness around issues of corruption, but also to encourage people and citizens to be able to report, whatever, cases of corruption that they encounter. With regard to, that particular tool, for example, I think that the usability from our end has really been quite good. When we launched, the tool and the campaign, we launched it as a 3-month pilot, and over the last 3 months, we have received over 200 individual stories that people have shared on, their experiences with corruption, touching on different sectors and touching on different extents. It's really a wealth of data that we've been able to gather. And I think what that is doing also is that it is helping to feed into our advocacy work. So some of the stories that we have received, we've been able to use that as a basis to engage with some, government entities, government bodies maybe that are mentioned, to be able to enhance our advocacy, our national level advocacy in that sense. So I think that there is a lot to learn, and there is a lot that we're still learning even as we go forward. But I think the aspect of tools being usable and being simplistic enough to allow for citizens to come along and to be able to make use of the tools, I think is something that has been a very key lesson for us from this campaign. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maurice, and thank you very much, everyone. I must begin by thanking everybody that was in the audience today. Thank you for making time to be part of today's session. My panelists today were Kavisha Pillay, the head of stakeholder relations and campaigns at Corruption Watch. Thank you very much for making time to be on the panel, Kavisha. And also thank you to Cherise Takwa, who is the advocacy coordinator at Amawungane Center. Cherise is smiling. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. Apologies if I am. From Amawungane Center for Investigative Journalism, and Samuel Kimeu, the executive director from Africa's Voices Foundation, and of course, Maurice Nyambe, the executive director from Transparency International Zambia chapter. My name is Jimmy Maliseni from the Alliance for Community Action in Lusaka. Do enjoy the remainder of DIY Africa and Jamfest. Remember to share and remember to attend as many events as you possibly can. Do have a lovely morning.
Singamakawe.
Sisi wenyewe ni mashujaa.
Nous sommes nos propres héros.
Tirimagamba Pachedu.
We are our own heroes.
Power to the innovators, the DIYers across the continent.
Power to you who push the doors wide open.
Power to you who've planted good seed on fertile African ground. We celebrate you. Thank you for joining us. Visit our websites and social media platforms to continue the conversation.
Singamakawe.
Okay. If you're still here, I'll just play a song and we can all go and have a lovely afternoon. We'll see everyone in the afternoon if you're joining us. I have someone whose hand is raised up. I hope it's, let me just see who that is. Simple. Would you still like to say something? Can you put it in the chat if you're still there?
Listen, baby, aiko indaba ukumvula asiko isikoti ngitibisi kamalami musukwesaba ngifikela kuwe ngitibisi kamalami musukwesaba ngifikela kuwe.
Okay, and that's it. Thank you.